All right, welcome to one of our last few videos about our book by Jane Smiley. Of course, we are going to take a look at part one of A Novel of Your Own, chapter 10, and then our next video will be on chapter 11, A Novel of Your Own, part two. And I think in these chapters, she's sharing what is probably going to be the closest to what I would call craft advice in terms of thinking about how you go about the actual nitty gritty of writing and some of her insights into that. Obviously, she's still kind of operating on a relatively philosophical level, but I think there's some really valuable things in here. So let's take a look at what some of those are. Excuse me, at least the ones that I think stand out. Just in terms of thinking about what we're doing at the most macro level possible, one of the first things she says on page 204 is what you are aiming for is willing suspension of disbelief. And the first person who must suspend disbelief is yourself. And she's brought up this notion of suspension of disbelief several times in this book. And I think sometimes we presume that is not relevant when we're writing realistic fiction, quote unquote literary fiction. But there is still this idea of suspending disbelief in that we acknowledge that there is artifice, that no matter what we're writing, there is a certain amount of invention. I mean, there's lots of invention, but there's this artificiality to a novel. There's the construction of it, and we must decide as the writer that we don't have to disbelieve in the things that we're writing about. And then getting into some things about habits, novels, a book, especially a novel, must be a habit. She talks late in this chapter, and I don't have a ton of notes on this, about discipline versus ritual, the importance of discipline and habit versus ritual, and how those can get in the way. I'm going to kind of let that speak for itself. But what she's really talking about here also is the next quote. As with any discipline, from playing hockey to baking a souffle to playing the violin, there are certain requisite skills that a novelist must be comfortable with, but they're only skills to be learned, not inherent talents. And I think that is the tie into habit, that we develop these things and we become habituated to the processes and practices by doing over and over. There is a long standing debate, for lack of a better word, about the notion of, can writing be taught? And it's pretty clear that Jane Smiley is on the side that believes, yes, it can, that there is not an inherent talent necessarily. My perspective is that there are people whose brains are wired to more easily acquire these skills, and that perhaps the degree to which they can understand them and utilize them has a higher ceiling than others. But it's not like anybody was born with novels in them, in that there's an inherent, this person will be able to write a novel no matter what, right? But I think there are learning skills that can be inborn in some capacity. But that's not really the point. But the point is to think about this. She talks about this what I'm going to call the skill pyramid. And this is kind of with the topmost layer in the smallest font here. But these are the 5 layers of writing skill and aspects that she views as most important. She starts her conversation with punctuation, grammar, and spelling, then moves to diction, then storing in character / plot and protagonist, then setting and theme / what she calls the specific and the general, and then she ends with complexity. So let's just run through each of the highlights of each of these first. So when she talks about this, punctuation, spelling, and grammar are just as likely to be a skill as they are to be a talent. Whether you have an inborn understanding of grammar and language, again, that can have to do with the way your brain is wired. But it's also the most artificial layer, in that it is in many ways the easiest to learn, but in some ways, although it's the foundation because it's the way that you convey basic meaning, it is the least important in terms of what you are at the heart of what you are trying to do from an artistic perspective. But as she says, it does define the activity we are engaged upon, the employment of prose to entertain and delight. You can't entertain I'm sorry, not delight, enlighten. You can't entertain and enlighten without the employment of prose. And so, if you struggle with any grammatical things and spelling and punctuation and that sort of thing, I would actually really recommend Strunk and White. That's E.B. White. Their book, on writing. I'm sorry, not on writing. That's Stephen King. Stephen King's on writing, but The Elements of Style by Strunk and White has some very basic and valuable like tools for learning the basics of these things that you may not have thought about before, or you may have trouble putting into words that can be quite useful. But these are your typical basic sentence level concerns, mostly functional, but certainly you convey meaning through them. But more specifically, we certainly present more meaning through diction, and that is choosing the right words. And the way that and what she has to say here is that choosing the right words is an effort, but the right words are inspiring. So it's about figuring out what the right words to tell your story are. As she says, all writers begin with some sort of diction, and then they develop it further. She mentions the story of Dickens, who had this ability to mimic the voluble lower class characters, and then slowly developed a more complex and broader sense of diction. And I think that the nice thing to remember here is that any diction is good enough for writing some novel. So, whatever level of diction or language capacities you currently have, there is a novel that you can write that. And the question then becomes, what is the novel that can write? And is it good enough for writing the novel you want to write? How do you find that level of match, right, with what your diction capabilities are and the story that you can tell with them? And then the thing that I like to that she thinks about here as well is that what is difficult is not to write something new, but to write something interesting and true. To pursue truth and interest is much more productive than to pursue originality, which will happen in any case. And depending on how one defines originality and the words new, that might also be an impossible task. There are not really any new stories to tell, but there are interesting ways of telling stories that are still out there. So think about how you can be interesting, but also how you're digging at those truths that we've talked about at various points in the course. Okay, so then she gets into, I really like the way that she spreads some of these terms that you've certainly encountered before, both in this class and before, into the layer of story and character, or the way she thinks about it, plot and protagonist. The special appeal of the novel is the alternation of action and reflection. This is where we talk about those internal thinking through things, that's reflection, and the actual events that unfold. And she also talks about this in terms of event versus meaning. And that most beginning novelists are often naturally event types or meaning types. That is, do you dwell in the way characters think about things that happen to them, or do you dwell in the describing of the happening? And most of us land probably in one or the other as the one that naturally occurs to us. And this just speaks to many things. But she says the side that does not come easily to you is the side you should develop by intelligently broadening your reading and learning how other authors negotiate the pitfalls of each. If you took our orientation course, there's a whole section on reading like a writer. And this is what she's talking about, right? When you read broadly, so that you can see how writers accomplish the things that you are not as confident in. Being very close and attentive to how does this writer or these writers, tackle the things that I struggle with. And those are going to be the important things for you as a writer to think about. And then she goes on to story, setting, and theme, this idea of the specific and the general. And as with character and action, setting and theme feed one another. Readers are likely, either by instinct or training, to extrapolate from the particular to the general. This is what it means to engage with art at its core. A creator, whether we're talking about books, short stories, film, television, visual arts, tactile arts, are creating something specific in particular. In our case, the story of a specific person or group of people, to make some kind of comment on something more general, which is usually the human condition, the human experience as a whole. Okay? And she says, for every novelist, wherever the larger ideas come from, they must seem at the time you employ them to be illuminating and bringing together intensely perceived particulars. So even if you know what you in general want your work to be about, they must be related to the very specific people, and I'm using people just in terms of characters, that you have stuck into the work that you're writing. And that's just a really great way to keep in mind and think about the balance of what it is that you are doing as a writer. Is that you're taking the story of the specific characters that you have chosen to follow or reveal to us and using them to speak to something more generally. And then the last layer is this idea of complexity. Any aspect of a novel may be made more complex, but not every aspect. She talks about Ulysses, how the deployment of the story is very complex. That James Joyce uses a whole variety of complexities of form. She talks about these at one point. But that the story itself is actually not particularly complex. It's about one day in the life of these characters, this very chance encounter where maybe they change. But what is far more complex than the actual plot is the way that the plot is shared. Um, and then she talks about this notion of sociological complexity, where you are trying to say something about the social world, but what ends up happening is in order to do that, characters have to kind of fall into types, and so they can become less complex by virtue of the fact that you're trying to say something complex about those types, if that makes sense. And this is the thing. These two things are so important to remember. What she says: keep remembering that you can please some of the readers some of the time, and some of the readers most of the time. But sometimes you will please only yourself, and you can never please all of the readers all of the time. It is impossible. I know of not one single story, poem, novel, play, TV show, film, work of art, anything that you want to mention that is universally and without exception beloved. It does not exist. It simply does not exist. And that's okay. And that is something that we all have to accept when we think about our audience, when we think about our readers. You do need to please yourself. One thing she doesn't mention is the essential nature of pleasing yourself. Because if you don't please yourself, you're not going to please anybody else. But you're also never going to please everybody. So don't worry about doing that. And then I also really love that what she says here about this idea of the perfect novel. There is no proper way to write a novel. No single proper way, because there is no perfect balance to all the categories. So back to our pyramid, you can't balance all of these perfectly. There's no such thing. Like, there is no formula. I say this all the time about all of the issues tied to writing that one is ever thinking about, is that so many of the questions and the craft difficulties that students encounter when I ask people to tell me what they want to learn about, so many of those things they want to know don't have a nice, tidy, easy, like objective answer. Some of them do, but not very many. Because there is no perfect balance, and so that's what she's talking about here. Is that there's only the version of a story you can tell, the way you come up with to write your story, and you can't really do a whole lot more than that. So just a couple more things that I want to highlight here in the latter half of this chapter. This kind of a smorgasbord of things. The key is energy. The key for you, the author, is energy. Every author attests to the two states of writing: inspiration and waiting for inspiration. And I really love what she says on the next page. Her theory is that inspiration is emotional memories lingering in the limbic system, becoming suddenly activated and asking the frontal lobe to organize and thereby understand them. So we have these emotional memories, and that is very broadly defined. That the frontal lobe, the conscious part of our brains, are being asked by our limbic system, this more sort of subconscious animal part of our brains, want organized. And we do that through the creative mediums that we enjoy. In our case, writing of many sorts. But she talks about what happens if you are losing interest or suffering from what she only briefly calls writer's block. And this is on page 222. She mentions boredom is really a feeling of fear. What is happening is that your intuition is conflicting with your reason, and perhaps even taking over from it in the composing of your novel. And my word of advice that I always give to people is to simply keep writing things down. With whatever frequency it is that you usually write, try to stick to that. There's no perfect formula, but stick to whatever you typically do and just put some words on the page. When I've gotten stuck, I just tell myself, let me write half a page of this today. Let me write a paragraph. Let me just write something down to keep the work moving and to simply put something on the page, even if I know it doesn't make sense. Just get over the idea of reason, because your intuition and your reason are in conflict. Um, and then this is something I've often said that people get a little mad at me about. But now that Jane Smiley has also said it, I feel safer continuing to say it. She says, for some writers, boredom is a sign that their ability to execute their own work is less sophisticated than their taste in the work of others. And this speaks to me and the notion of writer's block. And my belief, as much as you may not want to hear it or believe me, that writer's block doesn't actually exist. And what I mean by that is it's this very thing. What happens to us is that our recognition of what we think is good and our standards for what we want writing to be start to exceed our capacity to achieve that level. And so we get kind of, whether we're aware of it or not, bummed out. And as a result, we don't think we have anything to say because we don't know how to say it well. And so, and she calls this boredom, but I call it writer's block. And so again, I think the way through that is you just write things down. And sometimes this is why some, folks ask me about my own writing habits. So I'll just mention here in case I haven't mentioned it elsewhere. I'm often working on multiple projects at once. And part of the reason for that is if I do get stuck or bored with something, I have a quick and easy way to jump to something else. And as a result, I'm constantly at work and the creativity is still there and being drawn out. So if you are primarily a one project kind of person and you find yourself stuck on something, don't abandon it. Give yourself over to something else briefly, but always come back to that other thing. Again, at whatever regularly scheduled time you do that. Okay, that's all for this chapter. There's a whole lot that she has to say in here that I didn't cover. So I will not be surprised to see lots of folks perhaps having other things they want to bring up. So I look forward to seeing that. Thanks, everybody.